like I'm on the news or something. It feels really.
All right. Hello. Welcome, everybody. We'll take a little bit of time, wait for some folks to join in here.
You and I, Kyle, always meet in auspicious moments.
Yes.
We have a thing.
I love it. Yeah, it's a fun synchronicity.
It's definitely one of the fun parts of our friendship.
Yeah. All right. Well, welcome, everybody. I'm really excited to be here with my dear friend and colleague, Dr. Cohen. And today we're going to chat about why depth approaches, depth-oriented psychology is an important topic, especially in the psychedelic world. So, Ito, welcome. Where's your head at? We just had the lunar eclipse last night. We were just kind of debriefing and chatting a little bit about that.
Yes, that's hence the auspiciousness. Yeah, thank you, Kyle, and good to be here with you again. And I just want to say that we're doing this in preparation of our seminar coming Sunday, March 15th, which is going to look at new horizons in mental health. Like, what is psychedelics offering for mental health beyond just PTSD treatment? Where am I headed? That's a great question. So many places. But, I was thinking about, I think it would be hard to start this talk without talking about what's happening in the world and seeing how, sadly, the topics we're going to talk about, like grief and loss, and how do we bring a depth approach to dealing with grief, or I should say even be dealing, like learning how to experience the fullness of grief while utilizing psychedelics, and how do we change our relationship with loss. So we can't not talk about that given what's happening in the world right now. But I am very excited for this. Part of the reason we started these whole seminars and the reason you and I are doing this is to really bring up the topics that we talk about last in this world, in the psychedelic science world, and kind of bring them back into the forefront or give them more conversation, right? So things like, how do we deal with loss and grief? We're going to talk about eating disorders. We're going to talk about spiritual emergency, which I'm very excited about, and addiction, which is a huge, what I would say, huge issue in the human condition of our time. So I'm very excited for us to really try and continue to bring together the worlds of depth psychology, which means really looking, for me, depth psychology is about slowing down and nuancing these very complex topics that are very big, and bringing that together with psychedelic practice is such a fascinating and also necessary thing for me. So I'm very excited for us to have this chat, and I'm very excited for us to do this seminar.
Yeah, I'm really excited about it too. Maybe we'll start, for those that don't know what depth psychology is. Can you describe what is depth psychology?
I can try. I think depth psychology was born out of the emergence of Jungian psychology somewhere there in the 50s, 60s into the popular, conversation in psychology, and transpersonal psychology was starting to come out the late 60s, 70s, right, in Europe, and Esalen in California, coming out of the 60s, and the hippie movement. And just the idea of broadening the understanding of what consciousness is and how we can use psychology to look at consciousness. So depth psychology, I think, in short, the best way would be describe it is to see that human existence is beyond Freud. There is more horizons beyond Freud, meaning we're not limited just to our repressed libidinal energy and impulses, that there is a spirit, there is a soul, there is archetypal symbols and energies we interact with. There is ways to explore those, right? There is practices, embodied practices, somatic practices, imaginary practices like active imagination or guided imagery or stuff like that, working with creativity, which we will talk about too, and art. So there are ways to explore the horizon beyond the psychological. And this doesn't mean to downplay or minimize the psychological, but just to say that the psychological and what lies the horizon behind it are
Right.
connected. Then how do we first acknowledge it and embrace it as part of our humanity? That humanity is not just limited to what we can see, feel, touch, hear, smell, to our five senses, like earthly senses. But also, how do we integrate the fact that there's a sixth sense? There is more to us than that, and normalize it. Not just make it into, oh, this is something that belongs in the 60s and the hippie movement or esoteric tradition. It's like, no, this is part of our day to day. Which is why I think psychedelics and depth psychology go so well together, because so many times psychedelic experiences remind us or reconnect us with that deep knowing, like, oh, wait, there's more.
Yeah.
Right? There's more to me. There is more to the people in my life. There is more to culture. There is more to life in general. And there is more than just this dimension of experience.
Yeah.
There's a lot more.
When I think about like, I guess like my brain goes to the Freudian iceberg, right? Like the unconscious. And it's like we have to go down to the depths. But I like what you're saying is like really expanding beyond that, because I think sometimes when we think about like the depth-oriented tradition, right, starts with Freud and Jung, and then starts to branch out from there. But yeah, something you said just about like depth psychology having soul, and I really kind of like take that also from like James Hillman's perspective, where it's like I think we have like a weird relationship to that term soul. But like I think I've heard Hillman talk about it more as like the life energy that flows through everything. It's the thing that like drives life to become. It's the energy that makes the flower bloom. In humans, it's almost like the energy that has us to want to create, right? It's like our passion and stuff like that. So yeah, I kind of see it as like the psychology with the soul behind it. And again, not like the spiritual soul, but it has like this energy. And that brings me to like a question and kind of wondering what your perspectives are around this, because, psychedelics do open us up to the numinous, to these other domains. And I think this is where, depth-oriented approaches are really important. It's like psychedelics, we can use that terminology, making the unconscious conscious, right? And then we have like a tradition that is already rooted in understanding this. But sometimes it gets pushed to the side because this area isn't evidence-based. There's not a lot of like scientific rigor behind it. And I've been seeing a lot more stuff lately around like therapeutic practices and theories that don't have like the evidence-based stamp on it, almost like getting pushed to the side recently. Like, I don't know if you've seen any of the critiques around like IFS and like some of this other stuff. People just, it's not evidence-based, but, also how important is it for like humans to have like theories and frameworks that really resonate with them deeply?
Absolutely.
Right.
Well, it's interesting. We're kind of continually playing the Freud-Jung conflicts, because Jung basically said the same thing. Freud said the same thing to Jung. He's like, this whole unconscious thing is not evidence. We're trying to make psychology a science. And you're coming to me with synchronicities, and it's like, this is, it's like, he said that it's borderlining like a religious dogma.
Yeah.
And he's like, you're going in the way of religion. Like, this doesn't work for us. And we're kind of continuing their argument. Like, yes, is evidence-based research important? Absolutely. You don't want to just, it validates, it helps us improve, it helps us expand. And, right, if we don't have it, does it cancel the validity of something? I think a lot of the argument around, we can talk about Freud and Jung again, right? A lot of the argument around the place of soul in psychology comes from our religious wounding. Most of us, when we say the word soul, it triggers consciously or unconsciously our own relationship with religion. And for most people, I think that's a very painful or complicated relationship. So we don't want to talk about it. But this is kind of the paradoxes of psychedelics, because most people also go and they experience, wait, there's something more. I don't want to call it soul, or I don't want to call it God, or right, so we call it spirit or the other or the plants or whatever. But we get in touch with that, and that's why what you said is so important. We need some maps of consciousness that are going to help us navigate these encounters.
Yeah.
And I think part of why I like this seminar for us is what comes to mind is I'm working with a group of people who have pretty severe PTSD right now within a context of a retreat. And for those of us who don't want to engage with the concept of soul, it's interesting how only when we suffer long enough and then we have a experience, we're like, oh, wait, that exists. So these are people who have been suffering from PTSD for a pretty long time, pretty severe PTSD. But inside psychedelic experience, all of a sudden they're like, oh, wait, there's more here. I haven't been happy in 2 years, and all of a sudden I'm full of joy and bliss. And one of them described to me being post-psilocybin and sitting outside and looking at this bird. And they had this whole beautiful realization just looking at this bird. It's like, this bird is free. It's perching on a tree. It's enjoying nature. I see it bathing in the sun, and it's doing all the things that I can't. And what does that bird have that I don't have? Right? And then they started going into their connection with nature and how it's right. And before we knew it, they departed from psychology. They were talking about something totally different. Right? So it's like, how do we move away from our how do we observe what limits us to experience the fullness of and acknowledge? You don't have to call it soul, call it whatever you want to call it, but at least acknowledge it. Right? We can call it the big S self, the authentic self, the spirit. And also, I'm curious what you think, Kyle. And we talked about this a lot during the years, that we've been borrowing a lot of these practices from shamanic cultures, and they are not shy about saying the word soul, or spirit. So why are we stripping that away?
Well, I think kind of like what you're saying too, right? It's like a lot of like the religious trauma that like we've just like, been in. And I think about something Martin Prechtel talked about in one of his books, that, we live in this cult of measurement. Hard to measure the soul. It's hard to measure the psyche. And when we live in this world where we're trying to measure everything, it's almost like it's hard to validate. Like, what do you mean? Like synchronicity. How do you measure that? Like, I was just mentioning like, the lunar eclipse happened, and somehow I woke up at 3:33, like when it was kind of starting to happen. It's like, what's going on there? Is that like an interesting synchronicity? My body just naturally woke up. Like, I knew in my mind that was happening.
Exactly. But who knew? Who knew, right? Who and Kyle knew that was happening?
Yeah. At that exact time. And I find that to be like really fascinating. Like, what's going on there? Like, why did my psyche want to wake up during that at that exact time? Why not a minute earlier? Why not a minute later? But that exact time. And that's, to me, I find that to be interesting, right? It's like, what is going on here of the things that we tap into? But something that you brought up, just thinking about these topics, addiction, eating disorders, grief and loss and death, right? Like, I think we're a culture that like kind of pushes death away and grief away, and also spiritual emergence and psychosis, right? And I think about, I don't know if you ever really got into Arnold Mindell, but he had a book called The City Shadow. And it makes me think like, this is like what we're trying to touch on, right? And his kind of like hypothesis in here was looking at like severe mental health disorders like schizophrenia. And we push the people outside the quote unquote city. And so these, topics that we're trying to explore is the shadow of the culture in the city, right? And so it's like we're starting to like work with these things that we don't want to face, right? Because it's really difficult. It like just activates stuff inside of us. Grief and loss, right? Like that's a huge thing that we all go through, but we all just don't want to possibly look at it because it's scary, right? It's like, ooh, how do I?
It's also a cultural taboo.
Yeah.
right? Culture does not reinforce or encourage us to look into the topic of death. And if you don't look at death, it's hard to look at loss or grief,
Yeah.
right? Even in this, even within the reality that we have right now, we still don't have conversations around death with ease or normality, or right. It's not. I shouldn't even say normalized. It's not embedded as something natural in our culture.
Right.
Listening to you makes me think actually about eating disorders, right? Marion Woodman talked about eating disorders being a issue of disconnect from soul, not a. And most of the issue from right, a big component of eating disorders is internalizing cultural shadow, the shadow of the city. Right?
Yeah.
How we are told we should look, what's beauty ideals, what's acceptable, not acceptable, attractive, not attractive. Pushing, right, creating even all the amounts of unhealthy foods we have access to, right? Even the idea of comfort food, right? That's an interesting. Why don't we call it soul food? Why don't we call it nourishing food? Why do we call it comfort? So we started creating all these associations that then impact us. And we will talk of Jillian, I know, and Gina, who will talk in the seminar, they will talk about it in the concept of like the working with women and with men who part of their process of healing eating disorders is actually getting connected with something deeper in themselves, seeing that there is some kind of hunger or lack of nourishment on what we would say on a soul level. And the psychological manifestation is the eating disorder. All right. Marion Woodman said, you're not reaching for a cookie. You're reaching for something that wants to sweeten your soul. Your soul is longing for something, but the psyche represents it as food. All right. So she says, instead of reaching out and listening to beautiful, I don't know, piece of musical genius in your speakers, you reach out for a cookie because that's what you're aware of. But deeper in the unconscious, you're actually saying, wait, there's something here that I'm longing on the level of soul.
That's beautifully put. I don't think I've heard of that before from that perspective. Yeah.
Yeah, you know, she talks about, and who Marion Woodman was brilliant. She passed away, a Jungian analyst who worked particularly with women through the body and with addiction. And she would work with her clients and say, when you want to reach for the cookie, you need to turn the question as to what am I longing for actually in my soul right now? And mostly for people, it moves from cookie to being, I want to be hugged. I want to be loved. I want to move. I want to express myself creatively. I want to be in nature. I want to feel sensuality. There is always something deeper there that was playing in the background. But because we don't have this frameworks, right, the depth-oriented frameworks to like do that self-inquiry, we're stuck at, I really want a cookie, comfort food. Right? I'm feeling bad. I had a rough day. I want a cookie. As opposed to, I'm feeling bad. I have a rough day. I want my partner to hug me and make me feel safe and feel some, skin on my body. And then I should probably go and meditate and take a bath and read a really, soul nurturing book. So that gap, right? I think what we're trying to bring is to bring more conversation into that gap, into the gap, like what you said, the iceberg, right? Between what we can see and what's actually fueling the little tip that we can see on top.
Yeah. Because like when we think about like some of these topics we're like going to explore in this summit or series, like bringing the soul or the psyche or however you want to define that into it, right? It's like, why do we, like, as you're explaining, like, what we really like want, like, it got me thinking about like, maybe some of my own stuff where like behavior manifests because deep down inside, like my psyche really is nourishing something else. And then we use X, Y, and Z behavior to kind of like feed that in a way, but underneath it,
exactly.
we're like, starving, right?
Exactly.
And it's like, I think about it from like, we live in this space where we're just so hyper connected, right? And it's like we're using technology to connect, but I've sat with it too, where it's like, oh, there's like this underneath all that, there's also this deep wanting, like, deeper connection, but sometimes we don't get it through this mean. And so, we just sit there and doom scroll all day, and we're like seeking that connection in some way, but it actually makes us, it creates a disconnection.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, you said something beautiful before we started, and if you want to write what Martin Prechtel said about what happens when we don't express grief.
Yeah.
Can you repeat that? I think that would be
paraphrasing here. Yeah, I don't but Martin Prechtel wrote he talks a lot about grief and praise, and he wrote a book called The Smell of Rain on Dust, really beautiful book. But he kind of talks about how when cultures and people don't grieve properly, and quote unquote properly, that looks different throughout all cultures, but I think it's really facing the reality that we lost something, right? And really feeling that loss and praising the life that was there. It could be anything, right? Like a location, right? I think when we think about grief, we usually think about like people, but when do we, grieve the loss of like a location where displacement happens? And, starting to see that a lot now in the world, and how that continues to like impact us. And so that unprocessed grief, the unmetabolized grief, turns into anger, war, greed, addiction, depression. And so, Martine also kind of talks about this perspective of like, we all have these hungry ghosts of our ancestors. And when we don't properly grieve, and they, don't quote unquote go on, they continue to haunt us in a way. And he has this line that, if we look at all the great migrations throughout the centuries, they've always been towards the west, and the hungry ghost chases us towards the setting sun of the west. And we're never really at home with ourselves, because we're constantly running from the thing that we haven't grieved. And so we become a culture that's kind of homeless in a way. We don't have that like foundation, because we don't, I guess like really metabolize that grief. And so, what does it feel like to actually like face those harsh realities and properly grieve whatever it is? And again, kind of paraphrasing here, folks want to dig into some of Martine's work, but I think it is a really kind of like beautiful way to think about, how we approach grief and praise and life. Like, how many times have I possibly like pushed stuff down, where it's like, what would it feel like to actually sit in that grief? And I think that's what psychedelics help us do, or like, breath work and like other non-ordinary states. I think I found that in breath work a lot, where it's like I found a container where I could grieve, the loss of things, loss of identity, personality, places, people, things, and like feel that anger. So I'm not projecting it out into like my life. It's like I have that container to like metabolize it and feel it and express it there.
I that's beautiful to me. That's beautiful. And I think that's part of what we're trying to gap, is that we don't have those containers, or we have very little of those containers. You're making me, just what you're saying makes me think of, okay, how much of the rage and power hunger and repetitive cycles we're seeing now collectively, how would they change if we knew how to grieve better? Right? There's like maybe it's a soulful or maybe naive part of me that's just, the image that comes to mind is just seeing us come together as people and just actually maybe mourning. Or first of all, just being really sad and grieving together. And maybe out of that, something new will spark, as opposed to more rage, more reinforcing the ancestral, like, no, my ancestors suffered, so we gotta keep going until we resolve that. As opposed to, because we know that doesn't get resolved.
No, it just perpetuates the cycle.
It perpetuates itself, because we don't know what a resolution will even look like. We said we have to know how to experience loss, to experience grief, to get to some new, to see what's the new that wants to emerge. And that also makes me think of, I know the panel that you're going to do around spiritual emergency. If we thought about what it means, if we had more soul in the world and soul in the way we frame our experiences, why do we see it as a spiritual emergency? And if you fly a few countries to south, it'll be like, oh no, this is a spiritual emergence.
Right.
And we treat it by coming together, not by isolating the person who's
The city shadow, let's put them on the outside.
Exactly, right? It's like
Yeah.
the leopards. Let's put them in the city gates outside so they don't contaminate everybody else. As opposed to like, no, let's wrap the entire village around them. Let's bring it all to, let's like hug them together so we can help the emergence of the spirit. Because this is what we want. We want the emergence of the spirit. That's the higher value, not this kind of fake homeostasis where we don't bother, right? The collective agreement. So if Kyle comes back from an experience and he's like, oh my God, I met all these, I met the devil, and I have, look at us, we're living unhealthy and grief and loss. And it's like, oh, Kyle is having a spiritual emergency. We have to like isolate them. His message is nonsense. There is nothing here for us.
And what type of loneliness does that create in somebody, right? Not feeling supported, feeling like you're just totally alone, and then feeling like you are going crazy, right? Like, then where do you seek support if everybody's trying to push you outside the quote unquote city and they're keeping you on the outskirts, right? Then you're kind of like lost and you're like, help me, asking for help. But everybody's like, no, this is too much, right? Let's push you on the outskirts. We'll have something else deal with you.
There is a great paper called Being Sane in Insane Spaces, which is someone did this study and they, I don't remember exactly, but basically they somehow self-administered themselves into a mental health institution. This was like 30, 40 years ago. And they basically were trying to make the point that they just acted as they act every day. But they said the moment you're in an environment that is focused on searching how you are deviant and what's wrong with you, he said they kept me hospitalized, although I acted absolutely normal, like I would act with any group of people, because they are so focused that's
on
what
any
they see.
deviation. Yeah,
exactly. So the focus is on deviations. So even if you try to act nice, like, well, they're pretending. He's pretending to be normal, right? Because if you're here, obviously there's a problem. And I think there is, in a way, I'm like, we kind of live in the same, right? Some culture created this idea of what normalcy or being an adapted human being is. And every time you deviate from it, even if it means you're like living from your soul authenticity, right? You're living from the depths. It's like, oh, you're deviant. So there's something wrong with you. Right? Maybe it's a spiritual emergency. Maybe you're like, you have a grief disorder, which is another fascinating thing. Right? Maybe you're a crazy artist, as opposed to like, oh, look, right? The soul is supposed to be rich with colors. It's supposed to be depth. It's supposed to be full of all these things we haven't seen before. So, right, the question of the conversation of soul, and I think that's what we're going to do in the seminar, is between the personal and the collective. And we forget that the collective is structured out of the personal, right? A lot of persons create the collective.
Yeah. It's going to be, I'm excited for this. So again, for those that are tuning in, we're going to be hosting an all-day online summit called Expanding Horizons. And that is going to be on March 15th. So that's a Sunday. That starts at 9:30 Pacific time. And it goes till 3:30 Pacific. And, do you have the topics in front of you of what we're going to be exploring?
Yes. We are, this conversation has got me even more excited about it.
Yeah.
1 second, let me find it. Where are you?
And I could pull it. I have it too. I thought you had it.
I have it.
Okay.
Yeah. So we have embodied paths to the self, psychedelics, creative practices, and integrating the self with Mackenzie Amara and Yvette Fexter. Soul food, depth approach to healing untreated trauma, eating disorders, and disconnection from the body, which I'm very excited for, with Gina Grazza and Jillian Moore. When grief has no home, psychedelics and healing loss, with Deborah Gonzalez, who I think is one of the only people, if not the only person, who's done a study with ayahuasca and grief, and Christine Caldwell, When Awakening Becomes an Emergency, Psychedelics and Spiritual Emergency, with Dr. David Lockoff, who's been a pioneer for many, many years in the conversation on spiritual emergency, and you, Kyle. Yeah. And Pathways to Recovery, Psychedelics and New Treatment of Addiction with Matthew Johnson and Celia Morgan. Also, that would be a very, very interesting conversation. I know Matthew's been doing research on addiction using psilocybin. And just, I think, for us to talk about what addiction is from a depth perspective and how to utilize psychedelics for addiction from a depth. What does it even mean to heal or treat addiction, right? There's so many conversations about what does that even look like. Yeah, so very exciting. A lot of, hopefully, new horizons that we will discover in this seminar.
I love it. I think you have something, so I want to be respectful of your time. And so we'll start to close up here. But if anybody wants to join us for these conversations, if you can't join on that Sunday, the ticket does include the replays. So you'll be able to get access to all the replays, transcripts, notes, stuff like that after. And you can check that out just going to psychedeliciceducationcenter.com. And again, we kick that off on Sunday, March 15th. It's going to be an all-day seminar summit, and we're going to be digging more into these topics that are around depth-oriented perspectives. And I'm excited. It's always such a pleasure and joy collaborating with you on depth and shadow. I love it. So I'm super
Kyle, same. And thank you for playing with me in the depths of and trying to bring them into the light. And I'm hoping to see as many of us here on next Sunday on the 15th.
Yeah, likewise. Anything else you want to close with for today?
No, this is happy eclipse. I don't want to say happy, but meaningful eclipse, maybe.
Yes, hopefully everybody's energy settles. I know it's been an intense few days, probably personally, also collectively. All right, Ido. Well, thank you. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in. And hopefully we'll see you guys on Sunday the 15th. So take care.